to answer your question of where it starts, it's hiring creative, thoughtful people and putting them in a room and giving them, the autonomy to operate, without the handcuffs of what, corporate America has turned itself into.
Boy, you are speaking my language right now. Tim, hey man, how's it going? It's good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, always a pleasure. I thought I was looking in a mirror for a minute, but all good.
Well, at least you have the long sleeve polo on, and mine
Right.
isn't quite black. So, it's the best we could do. But, dude, I'm so excited to have you on today. Not just because you're a good dude, and I've enjoyed getting to know you this year, but you're leading such a big, awesome brand in NASCAR. Right. So if you don't know, Tim Clark, SVP, Chief Digital Officer for NASCAR, for all of NASCAR. This is a big gig. Digital content, esports, gambling. So I should say sports gambling, just to be clear. So much more. It kind of feels like a dream gig. So tell me, what in the world is a day in the life like with as Tim Clark leading up a NASCAR?
I always say I'm trying to do as good of a job as possible so that I don't have to go get a real job. Look, it's I grew up obsessed with sports. It was all I cared about, and I would say that I grew up, and that didn't really change. Some would argue maybe I never did grow up. But to have the opportunity,
that's the goal,
for sure. Well, and it's being fulfilled. I think about it like if 8-year-old me could flash forward and see, what the job and what the adult life is, absent the amount of time I spend folding laundry, I think 8-year-old Tim would be pretty fired up that like working in sports is great. It's phenomenal. And I didn't know that this type of job existed when I was growing up, but it's funny how things work out and how careers evolve, but I'm having a really good time.
Yeah. So, for those that do know my story, I started in sports radio, in college, and then after college. And I remember the moment I was listening to the sports radio station in Dallas, real famous there, called The Ticket. And I remember thinking, when I was going to college, didn't know what I was going to do. I was like, why can't I do this? Someone's doing this. Why can't I do this? And now I'm in marketing. So but I try to get back to sports as much as I can. And look, like a big part of this podcast is going to be me talking to people that are in sports, because the core of Radical Content is really talking to brands, companies, athletes. We're going to even talk to a few broadcasters that I know about how they are entertaining, connecting, and building raving fans. And there's no one that's doing that at a greater scale than NASCAR. I was watching a little bit of the content you guys are creating. I was watching Race for the Championship as we were leading up to this interview, and they do cutaways to the stands, and the fans are insane. When you talk to people, I'm in Orlando. Tim is not in Orlando, but people go up to Daytona all the time, and they talk about the feeling of the cars, or when you're in the infield. So talk to me a little bit about the importance that you are in the digital role that you exist, in the content role that you exist as a leader. How are you guys talking and thinking about engaging these fans consistently, right? It's not something that you do one day and move on. It is a ongoing relationship. And the people that listen to this podcast are mostly marketing people, content people, social media people that believe this, but sometimes have a hard time getting there. Sports, it's kind of inherently part of the job all the time. So tell me a little bit about how you guys think about engaging fans for NASCAR.
Yeah. So I think if you look at my job on paper and look at the functional areas that are part of my organizational structure, they do not make a lot of sense in kind of the traditional form of a digital professional, right? But the way that I think about my job and the way that I think the reason it came about that way is because, fandom within sports or consumers within any other business vertical, it's not what it once was. It's evolved just like everything else. So, I think the traditional touch points for a fan of sports or a league or teams or athletes or whatever the case may be is watching TV or buying a ticket and attending a live event. my job is essentially everything else. So, if it's, stimulating a fan by content on social media or playing a video game or placing a bet through sports betting or, any of these things that's, the way that we can keep, existing fans engaged in the sport and then introduce it to fans that aren't normally getting accustomed to it. I mean, it's such an interesting dynamic in a sport like NASCAR where, there's a lot of generational fandom in NASCAR where, if your
Yeah.
grandfather was a fan, you became a fan, or, if you attended the races with your family, then now you're bringing your own family out to the track. But that idea of fandom now is very different, that, as opposed to someone who may take time out of their weekend to watch a 3 or 4 hour race broadcast or, attend a weekend event,
Hmm.
the fan that's engaging on our Discord channel, I would argue is just as valuable, if not more so, through that content that they're consuming or that community that they've fostered than maybe the traditional definition of a fan, right?
Yeah. And so I want to kind of go down that pathway a little bit more. And I want to talk about sports and or brands, but for you, sports really being like a 24/7 media company. That's what it is, right? Whether it's through partnerships of content that you're doing with USA or with NBC and Peacock, or with other big partners, other big TV partners, or what you're doing. We'll dive deeply into NASCAR studios in a little bit, or what NASCAR's doing on own channels, on social channels, and podcasts. What? How do you do that? It's just the scale of what you guys have to do, and it's always been something I've loved as I follow other big leagues, right? Whether it be NASCAR or NBA or NFL. This is an exercise that's larger than a lot of TV networks have, done historically. Now all the TV networks are getting there too, but being always on with content that matters is a tough exercise. So maybe kind of go top line a little bit and tell us how you even start thinking about doing that. And we might dig in a little bit with some follow-up questions about how do you tactically even start to tackle stuff like that.
Well, the way you frame that question, I think is really interesting, because the word that I'm going to indirectly come back to is scale. And I guess to your point of starting at the top, I mean, there is a large audience that is so loyal to the sport and so loyal to kind of the NASCAR umbrella, and then by extension, the tracks and the teams and the drivers. And I think that's where it starts. I mean, the fundamentals of the on-track product and the people that are competing and all of the fanfare that goes from that. I've said this many times before. It's a really unique circumstance to work for a brand. And I know you know this just as well as I do, where you introduce yourself and kind of state the name of your employer, and almost 100% brand recognition. I've never introduced myself and said, I work at NASCAR. And someone was like, I'm not familiar. Right. So that to me is really helpful. But then if you take that one step further into the perception of that, that's where it gets tricky, right? Because you get one of two reactions. You always get the recognition, like, I know what NASCAR is, but then you can kind of read the facial expression of like what that person's perception of NASCAR is, like just a bunch of guys driving in circles, or maybe I've got a different appreciation for it. So I think, when we think about scale, I think you almost, I hate to call it a necessary evil, but I think that necessary evil is just the kind of the baseline content of whatever that core product is. Like the race broadcast, it kind of is what it is, right? I think what the harder part is, or the nuanced part, is being able to be comfortable with content that may not reach scale. And what I mean by that is, we've got somewhere between 36 and 40 drivers one week to the next competing. And that's just in one series. You've got two other national series, then international series, and kind of grassroots racing all over the country. How do you tell all of those stories without just getting caught up in the nuance of like, hey, this is like my baseline KPI, and if X number of people aren't consuming this content, I'm not going to do it. We can't think that way, because there are stories that need to be told, and you've got to be a little bit committed to telling the story for the story's sake versus telling the story because you're going to get audience scale out of it.
So, but how do you think about that? Because you sit in a seat, which is a lot of times almost like a digital marketing seat, where it does feel like it's more about, who are we reaching? How are we converting them? How are we growing our lead generation? And I get that NASCAR is a little bit different in a lot of ways than brands that think like that. But what you just said is like music to my ears, right? Because it's someone that understands the power of all of the stories we have to tell rather than the 6 messages that we can't get away from. And I think in marketing today, a lot of people get committed to, strategy, audience, message, go push this message everywhere. And what we talk about a lot at Maverick, and even back when I was at Universal, is, sure, if we got like a temporary, like seasonal event that all we care about is just trying to drive revenue, I guess that's a pathway in. But when you're talking about the idea of building brand, right? That's really what it is. There's so many nuanced stories. How do you translate that when you talk to your marketing colleagues that maybe sit on a little bit more of a traditional way? How do you talk to them about the mindset of how you guys think about content and story in this digital and social and content space to, if nothing else, kind of just not to change their mind, but to just open their mind up to, I don't know how to say it a little bit, a little differently, to just the possibilities of this like new world of digital.
Yeah. Look, I think a lot of it is like this Venn diagram of marketing to content to data and the coexistence of those things. I'll use kind of an analogy from earlier in my career when I worked in e-commerce. A lot of retailers will make 70-80% of their annual revenue in that 6-week period of time between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But then if you think about all of the consumer behavior that predates that, you're not targeting that person's behavior. That person is now shopping for someone else. So I've always thought that was so interesting that you're compartmentalizing, 10 and a half months worth of data to then go spend 80% of your ad budget. But that data is now meaningless, right? Because you're no longer targeting that person. And I think it's the same for us with the coexistence of content and marketing. I think we have to create enough stories that there's this diversification of channel mix and what the right stories and what the right delivery mechanisms are, that our marketing team has enough ammunition to go fill those spaces. Because, it's, you hear all the time about one-to-one marketing or one-to-one or one-to-many marketing. I don't think it's either or. I think it's all of the above. But, that ammunition, so to speak, for those campaigns is, it's finding the right audience and the right delivery mechanism, but the message and the content better be right, because that's by far the most important piece.
Yeah, you said something else before we got into this that I'm just going to say, and we'll put a pin in that because I want to talk about it later, about just all the different stories, whether it be the athletes, the driver stories. There's so much there. So let's come back to that. But I wanted to go into NASCAR Studios for a moment. So you guys have had a production group for a long time. You put on hundreds of events in a year, big events, right? You come in and you take over cities. And I've seen you say this isn't really new. It's just more of a focus on on-demand content from a digital standpoint. Why did NASCAR, why did Tim, why did the organization feel the need to put organizational structure around a platform like NASCAR Studios? And then we'll kind of get under the hood, if you will, and talk about the details of NASCAR Studios. But give me the why behind investing, building out NASCAR Studios.
It's a great question, and I would tell you that we have gotten that question probably as many times internally as we have externally. I think there are people that, their jobs exist under that NASCAR Studios banner that really weren't quite sure why we did it. I think they have since bought into it, but as silly as it may sound, I think you have to plant a public flag sometimes. You can say all you want how important a specific piece of your business is, but I think you almost have to hold yourself accountable for that importance. And I think a big way to do that is just stating it publicly. And, developing a brand and pushing it out publicly and kind of stating for the record that this is a really important focus area for your organization. I think that was, as simple as that may sound, I think that was it. To your point, we've had content production and live event production for years and decades. And, that group has a room full of Emmy Awards and other trophies for how good they are. But we really had to distinguish that original content creation and, producing short form content and original content was going to be a critical area of not only the business, but the sport's future. And so again, as oversimplistic as that may sound, the creation of the NASCAR Studios brand was us just making that public declaration of how important this is going to be, not just today, but, for decades.
Yeah. Was there any sort of audience insight, channel insight, kind of future insight of where we've got to get to that was embedded in that decision? You kind of hinted at it a little bit, but I kind of wanted to just dig a little deeper and see if there was something that you're seeing something and you're like, we have to go there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the fact that attention spans are now compromised in untraditional ways, right? It used to be you looked at your competition set as people in the same vertical. So if we're running a race on Sunday afternoon, who else is hosting events that are televised, sporting events that are televised on a Sunday afternoon? And I think that's no longer the case. So I think it's, we are looking at competition from someone scrolling through TikTok on their phone. And you could look at that as competition and try to shy away from that, or you can just lean into it and be part of that conversation. So whether it be a channel like YouTube, whether it be something like TikTok, you can participate in it, or you can hope that people, pick you over that. I think to your point in establishing that studio's brand and why that vertical was important, it's because we see where the audiences are and see where those behaviors are not only today, but conceivably will continue to be. And we just have to be part of those.
So, you talk about TikTok and YouTube. How do you show up in these spaces that NASCAR didn't build? They're owned, but more rented than owned. We call them owned sometimes internally, but they're more rented spaces. Yeah. The audiences have clear expectations for what works and what doesn't work. So how do you guys navigate as you come in? And I know there's a ton of examples that we can break through a few of them, but how do you navigate as you come into a TikTok? How does NASCAR need to show up in TikTok? What is the strategy for how we're trying to show up on YouTube? What are some of the discussions and then how does that relate then into content? Examples of some of the content you guys are creating for some of these spaces.
I am a huge fan of TikTok and what they have done. And I'll, the example I would use for the NASCAR entry into TikTok is I think it gave us license to take ourselves less seriously. I think I
love that so much.
Right. I mean, we'd used all of these platforms and we, would certainly have a little fun, but I think there was a line that we existed above, right? And we thought for whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever the case may be, we existed above that line. And for whatever,
can I just intersect something there? As I think that's so interesting. And I think that many people are looking at TikToks. It's like, okay, now we can be irreverent. Okay, now we can be entertaining. And someone that's been in social for 15 years, I'm like, okay, fine. If we needed a channel that was quirky and had music and GIFs to convince us that this works. But many people in social and digital have been saying this on Twitter, on Instagram for years. So I love that. I love the phrase. It gave us license to be on social what we probably should have been on social for years.
Bingo. And you're exactly right. It was, we broke ourselves into jail. It wasn't like the other social platforms wouldn't allow that, right? It's just we thought that's, there was a behavior that you had to adhere to. And, for whatever reason, TikTok was the one and, as silly as this sounds, we've talked about this internally before, there's nowhere to hide on the bigger platforms, Facebook and Twitter, now X, got to a point where they were so pervasive that there was no executive or sponsor or partner or stakeholder that wasn't there. And everything that you did was so visible. You almost thought, like in the early emergence of TikTok, you were like, hey, let's throw it out there. No one's going to see it. They probably don't even know this exists yet. So I think, we've had that conversation a lot. And, whatever it takes, I think then we got so comfortable with the engagement, that we saw on TikTok. And by the way, it doesn't hurt that makes the team, they were having so much more fun with the content that they were creating on that platform than any other. And then we just were able to kind of repeat it across the board.
Yeah, you hit on something there that I think is very interesting for people to understand. It's in a content team, creativity is the juice, right?
Right.
And when you get stale or feel like you got to do a certain thing, it can become stale internally. The ideas get stale. And when you get some freedom, some empowerment to go do things that are on the edge a little bit, it can revive a team. And so I love that you brought that up. And I want to
puts a little spring in their step.
Oh, it totally does. It's like what's the thing that, people say all the time? What's the best way to fix a team is win, right? Like best way to fix a content team, if you got a little lack of mojo, is put something out there that people love and just watch the juice show up, right? Watch them get excited.
Yeah.
One of the examples I love, by the way, I was kind of reviewing some stuff and I saw the Connect 4 with some of the drivers, where they're bouncing the ball, which is very kind of like TikTok-y, dude, perfect. Even like I'm here for all of it, right? Like it's a great, so good.
You know what? And I'll tell you a quick anecdote about that. That type of content comes from these media days that we have, right? So we'll have one at the beginning of the season and then we'll do one at the start of the playoffs. And, those things were set up. I hate to use the word antiquated, but they are. I mean, they were set up as kind of press conferences and headshots. Mm-hmm. And so, we'd run these drivers through these stations and, they'd go to 8 different stations and answer the same 12 questions and then do 2 rounds of headshots and then they would go. And I think a couple of years ago, we just were like, no one is enjoying this, right? Our team isn't enjoying it. The drivers aren't enjoying it. No one, the fans aren't getting anything out of this. Let's have them draw from memory a road course. Let's have them, play Connect 4. Let's have them lip sync Celine Dion. Like all of these things are now, literal things that we're doing with our drivers, and it's better for everybody.
Yeah, people in social media are going to hear this, and you're going to get an influx of applicants because, I think of these like press events. Like I remember they used to do like red carpet stuff for big grand openings at Universal. We'd have talent come out for the movies, and the social team was begging for time. But who got time? The local news station. I was like, no one's watching it. Like we have a bigger reach than, and so I love that y'all reevaluated those things and kind of, made them come to life. So to hook into that a little bit, how do those ideas come up? Like just kind of take us inside the hallways a little bit of the Connect 4 or redrawing, are there meetings and process for this creativity? Is it just the people that you're hiring, or is it kind of randomly? How does some of that stuff get fostered in the team?
I'm going to tell you the first step. It's me getting out of the way. And I mean that sincerely, right? I mean, there are, you think of the irony of how businesses are structured where, you've got these younger professionals that you hire right out of college that the only world they've ever known has existed on social media. They think about social media first and, they're really smart. They're really creative. They have really good instincts. And then you bring them into an organization and you have a bunch of, tenured executives that have been around for decades giving them instructions on what to do. And it defeats the whole purpose. I think to answer your question of where it starts, it's hiring creative, thoughtful people and putting them in a room and giving them, the autonomy to operate, without the handcuffs of what, corporate America has turned itself into.
Boy, you are speaking my language right now. Like, and it came up a little bit in my conversation with, Sam from Bleacher Report, now down at Misfit Gaming. It came up a little bit. He talked about social programmers, these younger people that live on the channels, know the channels. They know what's, culturally relevant, interesting. And you put like Tim or me to a meeting like that. And and it's just going to just go downhill real fast. And so it's so much about talent, empowerment, freedom. I think that's really good. Let's transition and talk about long form. We spent a little bit of time talking about some of the short form stuff that you guys are doing, but long form is a big investment, right? Whether it's the couple big series, and by the way, I have a rule that I'm not going to ask you about the other racing. I heard you say it. Well, everybody asks me about that other racing series on that other over the top platform. I'm not doing it because this is about NASCAR, not about those losers, unless they want to come on my show, and then I love them. So please feel free, F1, if you want to come on, let me know. But talk to me a little bit about kind of the point of long form, and I mean all the way up to what you're doing with USA, what you're doing on original owned channels like YouTube, and even some of the podcasting stuff. What goal is that filling? What audience is that feeding? What are we trying to do at NASCAR as we're creating, really, really compelling storytelling? Like this is not your old, we could just do documentary, 30 for 30s, which 30 for 30s are great.
Yeah.
This is you guys creating original content that I just think is kind of through the roof. But talk to us about the why behind some of those, and maybe even use some of the specific content series as examples.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I appreciate you for the number of times that I've heard the term "Drive to Survive." I stopped counting. That said, it is a tremendous show, and F1 is definitely having a moment. Right,
you did it. I did not.
I know. I just decided to rip the Band-Aid off.
It's all good.
But they've done a tremendous job, and I think one of the interesting things about motorsports in general, whether it's F1, whether it's NASCAR, or anything in between. One of the things that in my mind was a struggle for the first couple of years that I worked in the sport, that you almost have to flip on its head and turn it into an opportunity, is that it's not a highlight sport, right? I mean, you can take an NBA game and the Warriors may win by 30, and objectively it's not a competitive, a competitive game or an entertaining product, but Steph Curry's going to have a highlight. And it is going to be something that you can package up and put out on social channels, and it's going to get, millions, if not tens of millions of impressions. We aren't really that kind of a sport. And I lamented that for a long time. I'm like, how are we going to compete in a storytelling forum when we don't have highlights in kind of the traditional sense? But I think what we do have is a group of fans that's willing to make a broader investment into content and by extension, the sport. So, you talk about long form content, and we did Race for the Championship last year on USA. This year we're in production on our own Netflix show, which, as luck would have it, the minute we announced that, everyone said, "Oh, NASCAR is doing their version of Drive to Survive."
Oh, please. Hey, they say that about everything. Oh, tennis, they copied it. What's funny is like everybody in content's copied everything. Let's just be honest. It's been done before. We're doing it in new and different ways.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, it's I think storytelling that has a little bit more oxygen and a little bit more room to breathe, I think that's very much part of the mix. So, where you don't have the highlights, I think you do have the ability to explore those stories and tell them in a little bit of a longer form capacity, whether that's video, podcast, or otherwise.
So the one thing that I will ask you, and since you brought up F1, I'll kind of just lump it together in a larger, what is becoming a thing, right? And whether it's F1, NASCAR, tennis has done it now. The NFL did it originally with Hard Knocks, but now the new quarterback show on Netflix, and again, I think tennis was the one that I would say was the one that was trying to figure it out off of the F1 example, because F1 needed fans in America.
Yeah.
Like that's what they needed, right? And they use content to literally build their brand in the States. And actually, for anyone that loves content and is in sports like you or loves content like me, it's a wonderful thing for us, right? It paved the way for new forms of content and storytelling to be allowed at the table. And we talk about business. NASCAR or tennis kind of did it for a different reason. Bunch of people, older athletes are kind of not expiring. They're still alive. But they're kind of leaving the sport. Rafa is still kind of hanging on. But you got all these new young people. They needed a chance to introduce them to young people. So talk to me a little about how this content, when you pair really great storytelling with hyper distribution, which look, Netflix just has, and nothing against USA or Peacock or NBC, because that's the person that used to, give me a paycheck. They just have this, like, it's on Netflix. Oh, it's relevant now, right? It just reaches more people more naturally. Talk to me about the power. Obviously, you guys are going to Netflix, so there's a reason why, but the power of how content, when done at a high level and distributed with really good partners, does insane business value through fandom, which is, I love it. It's bonkers. But talk to me about how that is and why that's so important to sports today.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely fascinating, right? I mean, I can't believe I'm going to bring up Drive to Survive for a second time. But
My bad.
I mean, honestly, it is, you take a platform that's got 300 million subscribers and viewers worldwide and put content in front of them that's entertaining, and you've now seen the power of that combination. I mean, I can't tell you how much I appreciate a win like that, right? I mean, I think if you look at the increase in fandom that F1 has experienced just by, to your point, putting good content on a platform that's got that much distribution, it literally changed the trajectory of an entire company and sport, which is an incredible thing to think about. And, I think, PGA Tour is having a similar moment with Full Swing. Right. I think it gives you a perfect, a perfect convergence of something that's there for everyone. So if you're an existing fan and you understand, the ins and outs of the PGA Tour or F1, you're going to be engaged and entertained because you're going to get a view of that you haven't gotten before. And then if you're a new fan or a non-fan, now all of a sudden your introduction isn't surface level. You're going really deep right off the bat. And now you have a reason to care about these people.
Yeah. So going into the NASCAR side of things, because I think this is also important to say, we loved the PGA, the Full Swing. We like tennis. The tennis one was kind of lacking a little bit for me. And I could go into detail why, but I'm more interested in kind of your opinion about some of these things. What do you do to make them as compelling as they can be? Right now we're getting into creative exercise, really, which is a story, a narrative, a drama. Where's the friction come from? Because I think the tennis one didn't really kind of capture that, right? F1 had its fighting and have people leaving the different teams and going to other teams. Golf was introduced in just some really fun personalities and some really interesting personalities. How, when you're thinking about with a Netflix series or Drive to Survive, are you trying to push and pull creatively to make this content something that people don't click away from? People want to actually finish.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a similar answer to what we talked about with the social content, which is you have to get out of the way a little bit. And here's what I mean on this one. So, back to what we talked about with NASCAR Productions and NASCAR Studios, I think we believe and selfishly believe that no one is a better NASCAR storyteller than we are. And so I think we have traditionally looked to use our own resources to create content, original content, short form content, long form, what have you. What's going to be a big departure for the show we're doing with Netflix is that we partnered with Words and Pictures. So that's Connor Schell and Libby Geist and the team that did, all the 30 for 30s and did The Last Dance with the Bulls and Michael Jordan. And that was very much by design, working with Netflix to identify a production partner that knows sports and knows storytelling, but doesn't really know NASCAR because, there comes this inflection point where maybe you are a little bit too close to it. I think the first conversations we had with Connor and Aaron Cohen on his team, we were going down the line of drivers and I even caught myself doing it like, well, everyone knows this story about this driver. And they were like, I don't know that story, and then when you start to unpack it and dive into it, you realize that there is this point where you do get too close to it and it doesn't feel as interesting as it really does. So I think there are a million reasons why I'm excited about this project, but the ability to tell it through a new lens is at the top of the list.
Closing out kind of the segment on content. Thoughts on sports and podcasts. That's something that hasn't been quite as big of a home run for everyone, right? We're all trying to figure it out. And I'm not trying to say there's not wins there. There are. And at the end of the day, I think it's important to be testing and to be, trying to see what resonates with our fans and audiences. Where are you guys at with sports and podcasts for NASCAR?
Yeah. So we have had, a couple of podcasts. Mostly they've been driver focused. Because the idea is, to take some drivers, some at the front of the pack and some further back, that, it's hard to get that personality to come across for someone who's strapped into a race car wearing protective gear and a helmet and a face shield. So some of it has just been as simple as looking for mediums to get these drivers to, talk about who they are, not just as a race car driver. But, I think that market is really, really saturated, and I'm purposely not going to say that it's oversaturated. But I do think it's tricky, right? I mean, it's very easy to create a podcast, and it's very easy.
What are you talking about? This is so hard what I'm doing right now, Tim. What the heck?
Look, I mean, I am preaching to the choir here, right? It's very, enticing to create,
Sure.
a piece of content on a platform and a podium like this. What you do to differentiate it, that's the hard part.
Right.
And so I think everyone's trying to find their ability to carve out a little bit of a unique take on, something that has just exploded in popularity over the last several years.
Yeah. I feel like it's kind of the way things go in today's world. Everything is so, information used to not be so readily available, right? So the second that ChatGPT is known by one person, it's known by the world, and it becomes the thing that everyone's talking about.
Yep.
Same thing with NFTs, same thing with metaverse, same things with Mr. Beast, the creator world. And so, it does feel like it quickly goes from innovation to just what everyone's doing. And so to stand out, you have to, like we're doing here, think of a very original idea. Two dudes that look the same talking about content. No, but for real, you do have to think about, how can we do this differently, right? The audio, I was in radio. Audio has been around forever.
Sure.
So how are we doing it? How are we doing it differently? So back up for a second for some of the things we talked about. And I want to talk about speed and scale. We kind of touched on it, but we kind of went into a different direction. And I kind of am of this opinion that today, one of the biggest differentiators for brands and for people in marketing is one of the things that's the hardest for them to get to. It's speed and scale. And it's because they involve too many people. It's because they have a lot of thinkers and not enough doers. It's because they focus more on strategy and less on creative. And I could go on a soapbox for a while, but in NASCAR, I'm not saying you don't have some of the same challenges that the corporate marketing worlds do. But you have to have a speed and scale, right? You talked about the highlights. You talked about, not that NASCAR does that. You talked about all these different things. How do you guys create systems and teams and resources to pump out everything that's got to come out? Obviously, I hear one thing in that last example. Look, we're not doing everything internally. We're partnering with this group that's going to help us work with Netflix. And so we're going to have some resources from our team connected to that, but we're not fully doing that in-house. But there's a lot that you guys do in-house.
Yep.
So maybe just tell us a little bit of how you guys are set up to create so much. I don't know a better way of asking that.
No, my answer may surprise you a little bit. For a group that is part of a business that is entirely built upon speed, it's one of the last things that we think about from a content perspective. And the reason I say that is because I think one of the responsibilities that we have operating under the league and the brand of NASCAR is that you have to be the resource that's reliable. And I would rather be, the second or the third person to push a piece of content out, as long as I'm the one that's doing it reliably. and accurately and factually. So, I think there is, you raise an interesting point, right? There's a fine line of speed to market and reliability. You certainly can't be, I won't go full Ricky Bobby, and talk about being first or last. But I do think there's a line there. And I think we're much more content to be, authoritative and factual, than we are first.
Yeah, and maybe let me say that a little bit differently. I was probably, and I think that's still a good point for us to hear. And I think it's important that it's not just all speed. We got to create good content. We got to get it out in the right way. And being first doesn't necessarily mean best. I was probably meaning, though, a little bit around the scale of content, right? There's some people that are pumping out 10 tweets in a week,
yeah,
right? Or 2 reels in a month, or they really would like to do some YouTube, but they can't imagine building a team to be able to do weekly podcast, weekly YouTube videos, 100 pieces of content. You guys are doing that. What does it take for you guys to get to that scale? And how would you advise, marketers and brands that want to operate like a media company, but just don't really have the mindset like a media company, like a sports league does, to get there?
Yeah. That it's a good point. I think there's a little bit of the coexistence of what you can do with your people and then what you can do with products. There are some incredible technologies that, have the ability to automatically clip out, whether it be highlights or certain pieces of a longer form broadcast. The other thing that I would tell you that we struggle with, quite frankly, but if you're going to do a podcast that's got a video element, right? And say the runtime or the amount of that podcast episode that you shoot is 50 minutes. In my mind, I don't think of that as a 50-minute podcast episode. I think of that as a 50-minute podcast episode. Then I can probably take a 90-second rip that I can put on YouTube. Then I think of a 15-second rip that I can put on Instagram. Then I think of a still that I can put on X. Then I think of maybe a short form story post that we can put on our website.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is just a matter of being able to repurpose really good content to use. Not, it's not a copy and paste. It's
still got to be good.
It's got to be good, right? And it's got to be a little bit unique. But as you know, people consume content very differently, certainly from one platform to the next. So I think the more you can kind of squeeze out of that sponge to get one piece of content that quickly becomes 4, I think that's the best way to do it.
You know what's crazy and very meta about this is that response right there is going to be an Instagram reel as a clip from this longer form video.
There you go.
But no, I love that you said that, and I love that's where you went, because a lot of time innovation is thought of as technology or new ideas, but there's innovative ways of how we get work done, right? How do we go from one long form piece of content, and we got a whole calendar to fill? I'm literally putting down time codes, and I know my producer Lauren is in the other room, of some of the best clips in this interview, so we can cut those things up. I've even been thinking about, okay, but what if there's like a 4 or 5 minute one that's more like a chapter? Okay, great. Let's create a chapter full vertical video for YouTube that you got the description that just sounds like it's its own piece of content, right, but it's actually just a breakout chapter from the larger. And I believe the world, those younger creators are thinking like that.
Yeah.
Like they bring art and the data of how these channels work to the table so well. And so I love that you talk about that, because I think people could historically kind of snub their nose, creatives, at reuse, recycle content.
Right.
And I'm with you. It's like, is the content good? Can we get a really good clip? Can we edit it in a way? Can we add emojis? Can we use music to make it something that's compelling? So I love that answer.
And let me throw one more thing at you on the same topic. I think all of the content doesn't necessarily need to be created by the brand or by the marketer. I'm going to do my best to not, stand up on my soapbox here, but
soapbox it. Let's go. This is called radical content, Tim. This isn't for passive feelings and emotions.
I gotta launch into my TED Talk rant here. I I think that what social has evolved into is so much of a departure from what made it great when it first evolved. And what I mean by that is it used to be a conversation and a dialogue. And I especially, I heard someone say this years ago, and the analogy they were making to, look, if NASCAR makes a post on social, or one of our drivers, Chase Elliott, makes a post on social media, a fan comments, and then they receive a response. That's like the version of, like, if you went to a concert with your favorite performer and they threw a guitar pick into the crowd, and it's like this direct one-on-one physical engagement that you've got with someone that you've put on a pedestal. And I think we've departed from that, where now it's just, people are using social media to shout whatever their message is, and do that, 15 times a day and across 5 different platforms. And so I guess the point I'd make in terms of creating content at scale, some of it is just using that one piece of content to drive a two-way conversation with your consumers or your fans. And I think we've all collectively gotten away from that in social, that it's just, you're now evangelizing whatever you want to evangelize, and shouting out whatever you want to shout back, without keeping that dialogue going based on whatever the feedback is.
I like that. I don't think it's talked about enough. I probably haven't thought about it a ton, but there has been a transition. And I think that doing podcasts so easily, like we're doing right now, the iPhone camera, Canva, these new tools and technologies have given us an ability, now AI, to create. There's a lot of like crap that comes with that, right? That is just
Right.
kind of look at me. And so I do think that's a good reminder, for us to think about it. I'm looking at my watch because I know you have to go, so I'm trying to respect the timing. We got about 10 more minutes. But yeah, please bring any more soapbox, Tim, and we can always do an episode 2 if you got. We're just going to call episode 2 Tim Clark's soapbox.
There you go.
All right, so let's talk about innovation a little bit, because I know the guys at the Famous Group that you guys have done some work with. You can talk about the work you guys have done with AR and VR with the Famous Group, both kind of digitally and in at the events, or you can go elsewhere. But what I want to talk about is, how do you think about, from NASCAR as an overall brand, how we're engaging fans with new technologies, and the importance of that for the future?
Yeah, you made a comment earlier about the kind of the expectations that fans and consumers have now, and how quickly things go from being new to, and now everyone has that. And I think about that from our own brand, and from our own kind of fan experience. If we waved a magic wand, or waved one of the Men in Black mind eraser things, and then announced tomorrow, every car in the field is going to have 100+ points of data, real-time audio communication between the driver and his crew chief and spotter, and then live streaming onboard camera for every car in the field. And we're going to do all of those things. All of the data is going to be synced, and it's going to be available on your phone for free. People would lose their minds. But the fact that's been done for the better part of a decade, if not more, just makes it commonplace, right? So that, to me, is where you start getting into things like mixed reality and machine learning and AI of, all right, well, we've done this to ourselves. Right?
What's the next thing? Yeah.
We've raised the bar, and now
if you got to slow down, Tim, you got to slow down.
That's right. We need to
tell your team to calm down with all of the great ideas.
Stop doing this stuff, guys.
Yeah.
Take a couple plays off, champ. But you're right. You're spot on. It goes from new and innovative to, what have you done for me lately, very quickly. And so I think, and I'll tie this kind of back to that conversation we had about scale. I don't think, here comes another soapbox moment. I think if you look at VR, I do believe in VR and AR and mixed reality as a technology. I don't think that I believe in the headset and the hardware. And I think that because
I'm out.
If we were all locked inside for a year and a half, and that didn't become a pervasive technology. I'm not sure that it's going to. Now, Apple may have something to say about that early next year, but that's my own take.
Well, I'm with you but, on the metaverse stuff. But yeah, 44-year-old generic white guy here that doesn't spend hours on TikToks and screens in the same way this world is kind of growing up with. So I just don't know what we don't know from the next generation. But I kind of agree with that. Speaking of innovation, obviously you guys have close relationships with the NFL, with Major League Baseball, with the NBA, and with the other, major professional leagues. What do you do to kind of look across the aisle a little bit and kind of say, what are they doing over there? I want to do some of that. Like, I imagine that goes on a lot, and I'm sure they look back at NASCAR. They're like, "Ooh, they got cameras inside their cars." So tell me a little bit about how you guys look at these other leagues to try to benchmark, but also just get more creative ideas to engage your fans.
I think one of the things that surprised me the most about working in sports was, those relationships. I think, as we talked about before, I think you intuitively look at that as maybe those are our competitors. And I guess to a certain extent they are, right? We're all competing for the attention of sports fans. But I would say that some of the best relationships I have in this industry are with, people at other leagues and at the team level and at other properties. And, I think we're all competitive by nature. So I think a lot of it is, I've had conversations with, folks at the PGA Tour and, we'll talk at length about something, and then 10 days later they'll announce something. I'm like, oh, it's weird you didn't mention that, when we were catching up. So there's competitiveness, and I think you always want to do something first or better. But I think there's also some, I think there's a lot of common ground of both the challenges and opportunities. So I think those conversations happen more than certainly I would have ever expected. And I think most people think that they do. And I think that's true probably for other verticals.
Yeah. Anything that you've seen that you're like, ooh, we should do that?
Well, I mentioned PGA Tour. I am a huge fan of some of the things that they do, because I think they're probably the most similar to us, just as a sporting event, where you've got so many competitors competing at the same time at the same place, and having to compartmentalize that from a data perspective and a second screen perspective and a content perspective. I am huge fans of what they do, and keep a keen eye on what they're up to.
You still didn't give me an answer, but that's okay. We're gonna let you go. Specific. All right. I know you got to jump, so let me just ask this last question. The main reason why we're starting Maverick Content Studio and why we're doing this podcast called Radical Content is we believe inherently that brands are all about interrupting versus engaging. And we believe there's an opportunity to engage first, to connect first, and that over the time, that relationship and that passion will build your brand, not just a specific product or revenue. And NASCAR is just doing this so well. And we've talked about so many examples today about how you guys are doing that. But for those marketers that are sitting down right now and they're thinking about something they've got to do, or they're working on a new brand brief or whatever they're doing, and they want to do more storytelling, they feel like their brand has a story to tell, but they just aren't able to switch it to be about this, what we're talking about today. What is something that you would tell them, maybe a place to start, or something about mindset that might help kind of unlock a new line of thinking as they start to think about this connection? Really, it's a fan first kind of mentality.
I think the biggest thing is being realistic about what the goals are. And I know that sounds really silly and really basic and kind of a throwaway answer. But, the number of brands that I talk to that, will express an interest in, hey, you guys did this, or you were on this platform, or you launched this, how do we do that? Because you're not able to monetize it. I think that's a common challenge, and certainly a situation that I've found myself in at many times in my career. But I think you've got to be honest about why you're doing it and why you're investing either the time or the budget or the resources or all of the above. Because if it is just to attract, someone at the top of the funnel as either a fan or a consumer. And it may take, months, if not years, to recognize any, financial value or direct monetary ROI in that. I think you've just got to be honest about that, because otherwise, if you're trying to game the system to get budget approved to invest in some of these areas that we've talked about under the guise of driving some associated revenue, it's going to run out of steam and support really quickly. So I think the more honest you can be at the outset of why these things are important and talking to new audiences is a big deal, where it's going to pay off. I know that sounds so simplistic, but I believe that's the right way to start.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it is simple, but it's right. Like, you guys didn't start by going to produce a video or launching into TikTok. You started with, what's the goals we're trying to come after? We trying to be relevant to younger audiences? Are we trying to compete with other brands that are more disruptive and finding ways to express their personality more? Okay, then let's start to talk about what we can do in this space, right? So, I totally get it, and it's a good place to close out. But man, we could do this forever. I super, super appreciate the time. You got a big gig and you don't have a ton of time, and you gave us an hour. And so just want to say thanks for contributing to Radical Content as we get this up and running. Tim, you're a good dude. Appreciate it.
No, likewise. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm excited to see where you're going to take this platform. And I'll come back and soapbox at any time with you.
Yeah. All right. So we got to close this out here, and then we'll let Tim go. But appreciate you guys. Radical Content episode 3 in the books. We've got more coming. Big name guests like Tim. They won't all look like me, I promise. So stay with us. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you.